welcome to Mobbing with UX Designers, or Mob Programming with UX Designers. So my name's Austin Chadwick, and I'll be speaking with, co-presenting with Gary Saunders here. We'll introduce ourselves, but first let's give you a little look ahead to what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about basically what is mob programming, what does it look like when you're mobbing with UX designers, and what are the benefits, what are the cons, you know, what are some stories, and so basically Gary and I are just going to be sharing. And so who are we? We're your mobsters for this session. Like I said before, my name is Austin Chadwick. I've got about 15 years of software engineering experience, and I've probably worn a ton of the different hats that you can wear out there. So from business analyst to developer to scrum master to tester to coach to process engineer. And then a few years ago, I started experimenting with mob programming, and now I joined a place where I get to do it full time. So it's been a blast, a lot of fun. Co-host a podcast and video cast, which we'll share about here at the end. But Gary, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name's Gary Saunders. My current title is front-end developer. I've been working professionally on the web for about 14 years, starting as a Flash developer back in 2007. I enjoy making static mock-ups come to life, and more recently in my career, actually driving the design and user experience of software user interfaces, along with implementing those aspects in the code base. So happy to participate in this talk today.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. So we'll be explaining what mobbing is here in a little bit. And it's, but why experiment with this crazy thing called mobbing? And there are a number of reasons that you might want to experiment with and try it and see if it works in your context. Mobbing started out in kind of more code development and less with, design. But Gary and I's discovered it works quite well in that world as well. But where it started out as when it was kind of co-discovered about 10 years ago in the original mob programming team was they started working this way, and they had no bugs reported back from production for a year and a half. They were able to deliver to production daily. There was high amounts of psychological safety. So if you've ever seen the Google reports on what makes great teams, psychological safety is up there as one of the top items. They will have a low work in progress, high code quality, and just a lot of fun. And that's been my experience as well. It's just been a lot of fun. And as I've tried it out for the last 3 years or so, I've seen a lot of these effects as well. And so, going back to design, I think one thing why you might experiment with it is it kind of goes back to something that came from the Lean UX community, which is kind of mutual understanding, right? Collective mutual understanding. And with mobbing, you get that on the fly because you're working together and you're making the product together and you're making the designs together. And so I like this picture up top on the left was, I'm glad we all agree. You know, we all have something different in our mind, but we all think we agree. And then if you start drawing together or start mobbing together and start working on it together, you get that live on the fly mutual understanding. And I've definitely seen that happen numerous times with design. Another core concept that is good to basically establish right off the bat with mob programming is resource efficiency versus flow efficiency. Because from a resource efficiency perspective, mob programming sounds absolutely crazy and stupid. What are these two concepts? So resource efficiency is people being busy, being active, right? So whether or not I'm providing value to customers or whatever, resource efficiency is I'm 100% utilized. Every minute of my day is spent doing stuff, creating stuff, artifacts or whatever, code. And so, high, 100% utilized freeway is a parking lot. It's not moving. It's fully utilized, right? And then flow efficiency is a different perspective coming from Lean, which is not how busy is a person, but how efficient is an item of value going from ideation, from development, and into customers' hands and providing value to them. So how efficient does that process go? So from what mob programming does is it does something crazy from a resource efficiency perspective, is it has everyone work together. But what happens is, you can kind of see up in the diagram here, is all the wait time and queue time between passing things between people and handing off goes away, because everyone that's needed is there to work on the problem at hand. And so the example, there's a TED Talk here. We'll send a link to it in the afterwards in the chat. But basically, he was talking about from a medical perspective and helping a child, right? And so you have a child who needs help. Their throughput time might be 4 months because of the handoffs between all the specialists. Where at a medical facility, if all the specialists are there to help the child right away, that child gets the help it needs right away. And so mobbing kind of does that flip. Something we want to say coming right out the gate as well, before we start diving into what is mobbing and how it works with design, is the just sharing principle. And it's basically, we're not recommending anything here. We're basically just sharing our experiences. And the reason why we cache it that way is that every context is so different. And it's, the software world, the product development world, the design world is definitely in the Cynefin framework. Beyond complicated and complex, and maybe trickling into the chaos world. And so there's so many things unique to your context. But when we do share, it may inspire an experiment for you to run in your environment and something for you to learn and think about. We're definitely not saying mobbing works for everybody and everybody should be doing it, basically. And then I'm gonna hit a couple cultural items which kind of led to mobbing being so to speak, discovered. And one of those is the virtuous loop. And this is something we are very passionate about in our environment. And that's that there are these three things working together all the time: extreme ownership, retrospectives, and dedicated learning time. And so right off the bat, the teams are the ones who own how the process works. They own the tools they use. They make decisions about how they do their work. And so the team decides, the mob decides. That ownership is there. And then there's two things that we want to be happening constantly, continuously. And that's learning and retrospectives. And so for us, for me and my environment right now, out of a 40-hour work week, 7 hours are spent for dedicated learning time. And that is either can be as a group or individually learning. And then while we're doing our work, we'll do retrospectives daily or multiple times a day, or at least once a week, where we say, hey, what's going good and what's not going so good, and what can we do to make things better? And all those three things working together can lead to a lot of innovation and running experiments and trying to figure out new ways to work or new tools to use and that kind of thing. And then early on in the mob programming community, Woody Zuhl coined this phrase, turn up the good, being inspired from extreme programming Kent Beck. And basically, instead of maybe focusing on the negative, which can be good to do at times, but is to look at what's going well in your environment and then look for ways to turn up that good. And so like every mini retrospective, if we have one every day, for example, we find something good and then we find out how to turn that up the next day. That 1% improvement every day can really add up to a lot. And you kind of fast forward and you utilize that thinking, and you can lead you to turning up the good on collaboration. So this next slide that's loading slowly, there it is, okay, great, is basically a little bit historical of my career. So if you think about, dev, ops, quality assurance, and UX, my first 5 years I spent where those things were very segregated. And so there would be, dev would work alone for months at a time and then pass it off to QA, and QA would work on it for a long time and then pass it off to UX. And, there was definitely very siloed. And then I joined an organization that was doing Scrum, and we were on the same team, and we'd have some collaboration type events, maybe for a few minutes a day or here and there. But at the end of the day, while we were technically on the same team, these cubicle walls were quite thick in their impact on us, and we worked alone most of the time, and there was still a lot of handoffs and queues and wait times. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, I came to experience mobbing, and the collaboration was so awesome that I just wanted to turn it up and keep trying it. And so if collaboration is a good thing, what happens if you keep turning it up, or turning up the dials all the way to 10? What happens when you do that? And so that's what we've been running, and that's what we'll be sharing about today. And so when you do that, your work may look like this if it's in person. So this is going back a few years before COVID. We will have some slides later showing how we work now post-COVID in a remote world. But here are basically our development shop working in a mob programming fashion. So you'll see, you know, here's one team on the right and one team on the left, and there's multiple teams on the back. And as coined by Woody, all the brilliant minds working on the same thing at the same time in the same space and on the same computer. And so how can this possibly work? This feels incredibly wasteful, or, you know, what's the point of this thing? So one thing I'll say that has helped off the bat before we talk about how mobbing works in, on code and on design is Kanban, because it's very, very helpful in this process, because you have lots of ideas. And if you're in a more extroverted group, you have lots of people shouting ideas and lots of conversation going back and forth. And what Kanban helps us do is stay focused, right? So you can see the board back behind me of all the things to do, and then the one thing we're basically doing right now. And so as we're working as a group, if someone comes up with an idea like, oh, hey, wow, that workflow is no good, we could reduce the amount of clicks. It's like, okay, we're not working on it now. We'll create a card on it and come back to it and work on it next. But right now we're focusing on this one thing. And so that really helps us stay focused. But then is mob programming pretty much just the driver and the watchers? So basically one guy sitting there, you know, typing away quietly with a group of people just watching him or her, and feeling very secure and safe, I'm sure. It's just as the people just stare at him. And so in my experience, this is definitely not the style of collaboration or mobbing that I would encourage. But it's actually been out there in the wild. It's funny, we heard of an organization that they were going through an Agile transformation, and I guess some higher ups heard of mobbing and thought it was like a cool, trendy thing. So they set up extensive mobbing stations for people. But then they're just like, okay, everyone just start mobbing. And you pretty much got this, was the driver and the watchers. So people didn't really know how to mob maybe, but they just got together. One person would type quietly, and then the other 4 people would just be watching, or they'd be on their phones and not paying attention. And so this is definitely more in the anti-pattern category of mobbing. And because it doesn't really turn up the good on collaboration, because what good does it do just to stare at one person? And so enters the mob programming RPG game. And so this is a game you can go download and play to learn how to mob program, or at least a way to mob program.
Will we be required to compile it ourselves?
Oh, no. So it's not even a, it doesn't even execute, but good question. Yeah, it's more of a, it is in GitHub, but it's more of just like instructions, and they put it in GitHub because I guess we're developers and that's easy for us to do. Yeah, I would highly encourage you to play the game. And what it does is, as you try out the different roles in mob programming, it gives you experience points as if it were some RPG video game for doing those things. And you can level up and try out the different roles. But even if you're not playing the game, these roles are great to keep in mind, because it really helps collaboration go well, whether you're mobbing or not, because there are different things you can do to contribute. And so one tool note before we jump into the different ways mobbing has worked for me and Gary with design is you don't have to use a mobbing timer, but there's a whole host of mobbing timer tools that can really help with this, where you put everyone's names in a timer. And then what it does is when the timer expires, the screen goes black and prevents the person from typing. It basically helps prevent the runaway driver scenario, where someone has an idea and just starts inflicting it into the computer without collaborating. And so it'll force you to switch. For us, it's typically about 5 minutes or so. And then it forces someone else to be using the keyboard. And so jumping into that, the first role of the driver is that this is the person who is taking the ideas from the mob and the team around them and taking those ideas and putting it into the code or into the design. And so basically you're not doing your own ideas. The idea is to basically be the smart input device for others to put their own ideas into the code or the design. And so you can ask a clarifying question, type something even if you disagree with it, use a new keyboard shortcut if you know how to do something. And, you know, and a story that comes to mind for me was we were working on a mobile app, and the designer had come up with some great mock-ups for the new thing we're working on. And the product owner and the designer joined our mobbing session and started mobbing with us. And basically the framework we're using didn't make it easy to make it look like what they wanted it to. And so we were basically experimenting with them on the fly. So the designer would shout out a high level idea, and I was at the keyboard. And since I knew how to implement the high level idea, I would change the view or change the code and then run the hot reload and see how it looks. And so we're getting that on the fly feedback and experiments with all the minds that are needed to make the decision on what to do next. And then I'll turn it over to Gary to talk about the Navigator role.
Sure. So as the metaphor implies, this is the person that's kind of dictating to the driver kind of what to do, right? So driver is focused on listening for input from the navigator. There are times when the driver could be the navigator at the same time, but typically, you know, there's a dedicated role for the navigator and a dedicated role for the driver. So they kind of work in tandem as part of this collaboration effort.
Nice, nice. And yeah, and the navigator doesn't necessarily need to know what to do, and that's totally fine. So, you know, you could just literally ask the mob, hey, I don't know what to do here. Can someone guide me? And then they'll be like, oh, well, maybe we should change the button to look like this or whatever. And then to be like, the way you do that is you change this. And then then the navigator can be like, oh, okay. And then they can tell the driver what to do next. Yeah, and then the next role after that is the mobber. And so this is kind of the default role if you're not doing other things or more advanced roles that are coming up. And basically what's really important is to listen on the edge of your seat and be really engaged and trying to understand what's going on. You can contribute an idea if you have one. And so if there's a lull in the navigator telling the driver what to do and you have an idea, you're like, oh, I see the problem, you can shout it out. You can ask questions to help your own understanding. And a story that comes to mind for me is when Gary was mobbing with us. He joined our mob for a bit, and we couldn't figure out how to do some CSS thing, and he knew how to do it. And so he was doing some sort of CSS fix and refactoring that I've never seen before. And so basically I just needed to listen and watch very carefully and learn how to do this thing that Gary's doing. And then I'll pass it off to Gary to talk about the researcher.
Researcher. So this could be a role where, you know, the group's actively working on an issue and someone could kind of break off and pull up a browser window and start researching on their own potential fixes for the issue at hand. And, you know, while still being aware of what the mob as a whole is doing, right? So it's just kind of a branch. You know, anyone can turn into the researcher at any time if they want to crack open a browser and start doing a little bit of independent research. And then if they find something that's pertinent, they could basically let the group know, let's try this. I found this.
Awesome. Yeah. And yeah, the researcher is a great one to be doing often in the mob, because there's so much you can bring just from running experiments on your own computer or finding stuff from the internet to bring to the table. The next role, and this is kind of more plays into the interpersonal stuff with mob programming and collaboration on design, is the sponsor. So basically, instead of looking at the problem, you're kind of, for at least a little bit, focused on the interactions that are happening. And so, and as it says here, amplify the unheard voice. So I've seen this happen in a design kind of mobbing session before, where someone has an idea, or maybe they're quieter or don't assert their idea as aggressively as others. But basically the team or the mob maybe didn't hear it all the way, or they just kind of brushed past it, is to help amplify their voice. So to say like, oh, you know what? Sylvia had an idea here. I heard her say something about the workflow and how it's unintuitive. Do you mind sharing your idea? And so just giving them a space to say their idea, pick someone with the least privilege. And it can also be other coaching moments, like when we run the 15th experiment to get the UI to look correct, it finally does, and we can celebrate that, right? And so, whether when we're in person, we go get burritos, or remotely, we'll put in our favorite gift to accentuate the moment perfectly. And so, so sponsors are a really great one for kind of the tricky interpersonal stuff that can happen in a mob. And the nose, Gary, what do you think of this one?
The nose, here we go. So obviously this is another metaphor here. An example of this could be I get pulled into the mob to address one issue, but right off the bat, I can kind of sense something else going on, whether it's, I notice some CSS in line in the HTML, or something weird with the process. Or an example was the mob reached out recently and they wanted to run an experiment using an iframe and try developing an isolation over here and bring it in with an iframe. And, I raised a couple questions and concerns and recommendations, but ultimately in the end, I let the mob know, whichever direction you guys choose to go, I'll support you in that effort. And eventually we ended up using Angular libraries, which I think was a better choice. But the nose is just something where you can kind of detect something is a little off, right?
Nice. So iframe, what kind of odor does an iframe give off, Gary?
It's a very stinky odor. Yeah.
Nice. And so, so it could be anything that doesn't look right. So, what's written up here on the screen is kind of more for like maybe back-end code examples of things that are technically called code smells. But they could be, as Gary pointed out, kind of UI in nature or more design in nature. So, a workflow that requires multiple clicks that could be reduced to one, or something like that, right? And so someone can notice that and then just shout it out in the mob and maybe get a card created around that. Another role is the archivist, and this one is really key when you're doing design type work, is drawing, basically. So I think this role really plays in well when you notice people having a circular conversation. I don't know if you've ever seen this before, where person one starts arguing A, and then for these reasons, and person B says B for these reasons, and they just keep repeating themselves and arguing in a circle. It kind of goes back to that picture we had earlier of the different shapes in people's heads, right? And so to get up on a board and start drawing, if you're in person, or remotely to open up a drawing tool like draw.io, or at least that's one I use as a developer. I'm sure Gary has better recommendations. To start drawing, right? And so it could be decision mapping, saying like, here are different options, which option do you think we should go with? Or it could be literally drawing what we're working on, whether it's a design or a workflow. And what it really does is it helps unify and have that common collective understanding, so we can all be like, oh, okay, this is what we're doing, and let's move forward on what we all now understand better together. And then the next is the Automationist. This is kind of a bedrock of mob programming in general, and is why I think no matter how counterintuitive it may be that mob programming could be efficient from a flow efficiency perspective, it often is because, so you kind of go back to the original mob programming team about 10 years ago. What was happening was individual development was being done on several websites, kind of in silo from each other. And then once they started mob programming, they realized that there was a lot in common and that there was a big theme throughout all these websites. And so when they were being asked for more websites, they, as a mob, figured out how to automate them. And so basically they could generate a website almost instantaneously. And there's a couple stories of people being blown away by, like, they come in with an idea, and then it was either that day or shortly after, the new website was, generated via automation and was in production immediately. And so if you're taking on this role, you can point out a repeated task in a tool and a team process, point out boilerplate code, and propose an automation. And so one way I've seen this come out in a mobile team I was on recently was, for the UI, we had to handle translations, and this app hasn't really had that before. And so we kind of figured out how to do it for one page, but then once we kind of saw the pattern, one developer put on this automation hat and said, oh, let's write this script. and then it will basically set up keys for every page automatically and made translation happen much faster than anybody else anticipated. And then the last style of mobbing I'll kind of call attention to is basically freestyle. And that's where basically no rules, you know, you don't have driver navigator, you don't have timer maybe, and all this kind of stuff. And this is a style I've experimented with before, and it's been a lot of fun. And it can work really well, where basically it's almost like having a conversation with the group where you just need to be mindful of people, you know, not speaking or not contributing or not learning, and then just equalize it in a more natural way as opposed to a tool or a timer doing that. And so, yep, that's a great thing to keep in mind. And with all this combined, we'll be talking about cons of mobbing and designing here in a little bit. But one positive that I've seen is basically the steamroller effect, where maybe it doesn't feel like things are moving hyper fast like a motorcycle, but any problem that comes to the mob, all the people that are needed are there, and we can solve it, right? So if it's a, you know, if it's an issue that involves back end, front end, and design, we're all there and we can help figure it out. If it's a design issue, but it has interplay with other things, everyone's there, and we can solve the issue much quicker than working independently and then going through some sort of review process. And it just basically can demolish everything in its way as it relates to problems. And so emergencies leading to change. You know, this has played a big part in, I think, many aspects of my career. And it was with the original Mob too. So when mob programming was, so to speak, co-discovered about 10 years ago, they had been learning in a collaborative fashion in their learning time, but with production work, they were still working solo, that is. And someone was faced with a really tough problem with a really tough deadline. And so they called the team in for a meeting. And then as they were working through the problem, they just started working in that collaborative fashion they did in learning time. And then all of a sudden, they loved it so much that they just wanted to keep working this way. And they were just solving so many problems that way. They just kept wanting to keep mobbing. And so that's what kept happening. And so a recent emergency, so to speak, leading to change is when we were in person and doing mob programming, and then we had to switch to COVID. And so what that led to was from the pictures before, we had everyone in person sitting next to each other at these big screens. Now we have our setups at home with the code, the Kanban and the mobbers. And so that way it basically mimics that entire experience of being with people, but just through screens instead. And it's been fantastic. And I used to be really skeptical of remote mob programming, but thankfully many people before we had to, because of COVID, go remote, had already figured out how to do it well remotely. And we were able to stand on the shoulders of giants and basically come up and running with it. And now I love remote mob programming, and I actually prefer it to in person, even though in person is still great. And let's see, what do we got here next? Yes, so talking about interpersonal issues before. So kindness, consideration, and respect becomes really, really important when you're working with people all day and are having these mobbing sessions, right? And so, so if there's grudges, if people aren't treating each other well, it's going to make it really, really hard to innovate and come up with great designs and great ideas. And so being kind and considerate and respectful and treating each other well, and that often takes retrospectives and learning, because different people have different styles of communication, and learning how to work with each other well can take time, but it's a great investment for just investment in people and in innovation of the product. And then psychological safety. So the kindness, consideration, respect builds to psychological safety, where you can bring your whole full self to work. If you see an issue, you're free to share it. If you have an idea, you're free to share it. You're able to disagree in a healthy way with each other. And that's when everyone's bringing their ideas to the table. I've seen really great designs and really great products come to light with that high psychological safety. And one other thing about environment is that people might be like, well, are you working in this way? Are you like handcuffed to your mob or to your person you're pairing with? And so if anybody's been to an open space conference before, they have the law of personal mobility, which is basically, if you're not learning or contributing, switch to a different session in the conference, right? There's nothing wrong with switching around. And the same applies for us. If I'm not learning in my mob, if I'm not contributing, then I can go switch to another mob. And if I need to researching on something on my own and then come bring that to my mob, that's great. There's the law of personal mobility. And tools. So I'll talk real briefly about tools, but we'll put some links in the chat about how to do this remotely. So there's basically kind of like two schools of thought with remote tools. One is people share their screens, and then the artifacts, whether it's code or whatever you're working on, gets passed through a Git handover tool. So when driver navigator switches, it'll actually go through Git and then come down to the next computer, hitting the mob next command on the terminal. And then that's how people switch the different roles and move the artifacts and the code through each other's computers. Another is the style me and Gary are more comfortable with, because we do it more often, is kind of the remote desktop style, or AnyDesk or TeamViewer or other tools, where literally when Gary and I mob, we're remoting into the same mob stations that you saw in the pictures before when we were in person, but we're all sharing the same session. And so we can even use the same mob timer tool. So when it says switch, I just stop using the keyboard and mouse and disable my control. And then Gary's can start using it right away, and it's very seamless. So there are different pros and cons to each approach, but those are a couple different ways to do it. Frequency of design mobbing. So Gary and I have different frequencies here. Gary, do you want to share about yours?
Sure. So, my role is kind of unique, where I'm not a full-time programmer. Actually, in the last couple of years, taken on a lot more design responsibilities. But it seems like, I'm on call for the mob. Anytime the mob needs me, I'm there for them to reach out, and vice versa. So it really depends on what's going on. Sometimes the frequency may be once a week, or it may be every day of that week. There's something going on with various different mobs. So there's no set interval. I do make an effort to join the Tuesday stand-ups every morning with the mob, because that usually includes a lot of the product owners and relevant stakeholders and whatnot. And it's a good time to just kind of get on the same page without kind of derailing the stand-up itself. But yeah, it just varies. It depends on what's going on. It's a very dynamic environment here. So there's no set interval. It's just when the time is needed, we make it happen.
Yeah. And that's a great highlight to, for finding what works in your context, right? So for me, being a full stack developer, I love doing it full time, and it's fantastic, but maybe that's not for everybody. Some people are like Gary, and who are on the edge of the mob, so to speak. So they are there and available when the mob needs it, or vice versa. And so there's mob programming pattern libraries, and edge of the mob is one of the patterns in there. And then some people mob at certain intervals, like, once a week, mob Mondays, they'll mob for a while, or they mob several hours a day. But it's just finding out what works for your team. And the next slide is Gary will start sharing about some of the benefits of designer mobbing. Oh, there it goes.
Sure. So like Arnold's saying, do it now. This is definitely one of the benefits. There's no delayed communication factor or anything of that nature. The mob calls me in, and it's always better if I can recognize the issue early on, but if not, it's still fine. But it's basically get in there. It's a front end issue. It's a UI issue. We can address the issue. We can perform a fix, and we can commit and push the code right from there and basically move on to the next thing. So that's definitely a benefit of everyone kind of working collaboratively at the same time on the same issue there.
And yes, that is from Total Recall. The first time I joined an environment where we were doing mob programming full time, it was quite incredible. To do it now was I joined a team. We were working on a language I've never worked on professionally before, but I was learning and contributing, and we moved an item all the way to production in one day. And it was quite phenomenal because everyone who was needed was there. Yes, communication, Gary, what are your thoughts here?
Sure. So I actually see a comment here. If on the edge, how do you resolve priorities? Say a mob needs you and you need the mob, vice versa. And this is the beauty of Microsoft Teams. We're all connected. It's just a matter of clicking a button and reaching out, and vice versa. But as far as benefits of communication, obviously, like I said previously, if everyone's there working on the same thing, it's much easier to effectively communicate your ideas than if it was kind of the traditional sense of, I'm going to send an email to this person might send an email to this person, and eventually you might get an answer, a response, or something helpful, but it doesn't beat everyone just being there, having a conversation in real time about what's going on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And to Justin's question a little bit, to the we start to sense our need for Gary, and then we ping him as the need starts to grow higher. We start pinging him early on to see, hey, Gary, you going to be available sometime today or the next hour or so?
Sure.
Yep. And then it usually tends to work out. So I'll share a brief story. I'll put a link to the show notes, not the show notes, into the chat here in a little bit, on Damien's mobbing UX story. So he shares a story about how he was actually working as a mob with some developers, but then they were in this kind of handoff mode with the designer where they would have questions, or they would have an update on, they'd make changes, and then they would be waiting basically for the email or for the chat message. And it was often because of time zones. They might be waiting a full day. And so this was going on for a while. And then what they said was like, hey, let's just bring in the designer to our mob session and see what happens. And what they realized, a couple key things they noticed right away was empathy. So when you're talking with someone face-to-face, remotely or in person, and understanding their situation, they can understand like, oh, wow, that's why they responded that way. These are the pressures they're under, and these are their constraints. And then the designer could also see like, oh, wow, it's not super easy just to do it however I said to do it. The framework has limitations, and they kind of get to experience that firsthand for at least a little bit of time. And then the wait time went down to nothing. Their questions were answered right away because everyone's there together. And they can make the changes on the fly and see, and then be like, yep, that's it. We need to, we can shift that, or, okay, we got it closer. And when we mob again tomorrow, we'll finish off the last pieces. And then Gary, what's another benefit of mob designing and Batman?
Sure. So this is kind of an interesting story. I've been working with the mob for a couple of years now, and I don't know how it evolved, but it evolved to where I'm essentially a Batman for them. That if they need me, it's not just reaching out for a chat, it's just sending me an animated GIF of Batman or the bat signal. So it kind of makes it fun and it's cool. And, I guess one of the benefits is when you're working collaboratively, it can kind of help demonstrate and reveal what you're good at. So, just by recognizing things in the group setting that others might not recognize, it can kind of reinforce, what you might be more skilled in others as far as the group. And it's an interesting kind of concept there. So, as far as another benefit to it, you could have your own internal kind of superhero hatch, so to speak, right? Depending on the feedback you're getting from the mob and insights you're able to provide in that group setting, I guess, is kind of the gist of that one.
Yep. And Gary definitely has a rock star status. So he is deeply respected for what he brings when he joins the mobbing sessions. So yeah, there's lots of praise for Gary. All right, now let's get to some challenges. What are you thinking here, Gary?
Sure. So obviously, no system's perfect. And, these are just kind of my experiences from my perspective. So I talked about how it's easier communication, but at the same time, if everyone's always working in a mob and you just need to convey something maybe simple or whatnot to somebody, who do you reach out to? You could blast the entire mob. You could blast all the mobs for a particular software, but sometimes it just feels counterproductive, or you don't want to bother them. So it can be a challenge to figure out, when's the best time to bring up a subject. And sometimes that occurs in that Tuesday morning stand-up, like I said, or it just requires setting aside some time or reaching out and seeing when the mob has time, or vice versa. So it can be a challenge because everyone's working as a group and you may need to speak with one individual, or, everyone's working together. So how can you don't want to just butt in and interrupt people. So that's kind of an etiquette thing, I guess.
Yeah, and it's a challenge. And I think every group, I've heard it described, each of our mobs are like boutiques. They each have their own styles and different ways of working. And some mobs are just like, barge in, just join the call and, interrupt us right there. That's fantastic. Others, like the message through like Teams or Slack or that kind of thing. So learning to discover that can be a challenge. And how about another challenge, Gary, being starting from the bottom and now we're here. As there looks like, there we go. Finally ticked. There you go.
Sure. So, these are just my experiences. The mob has a process that they follow. It can seem though that things take a long time for turnaround or it just seems slow in general. Examples, making like a full-fledged prototype with Angular components, the markup styles, everything's there. It's ready for the mob. It's ready to work together with the mob to implement it. And they have other priorities. Like I said, it's so dynamic. Priorities shift on a weekly basis, if not daily. So it gets kind of put to the side, and then, time permitting, we might get back to it. And so it can be a little frustrating because you have a great idea for a feature and it just takes a while to see it through, right? And I guess that kind of ties into not seeing the vision all the way through. So, a principle from UX, Lean UX is small batch size. You're supposed to focus on just the designs that are necessary to move the team forward. But it's hard from a designer's perspective because you have a vision for the whole entire system, and we're going to break it down into smaller chunks. But, there's been plenty of times where I've designed some features, part of a bigger feature, and it just was that part of the feature was a lower priority. So we never got around to implementing. We have a central irrigation control system software we're building, and it has programs. And the idea was you go into a program and it shows some summary information for the program and allows you to configure the program. We never got around to implementing the summary information, which would be beneficial and helpful to the user, but according to product owners and whatnot, it's not as high of a priority as some other pressing issues that are coming down the pike. So it can be a little frustrating in that sense too, because you have a vision for the entire system, but it takes time and priority shift. So it's not as straightforward from A to B, right?
Yeah. And I've definitely seen that from kind of the full stack perspective too, where, maybe a product person, has this grand vision and you get really excited about it and you get 3 of the 10 steps in and they're all individually releasable to production. And you get really excited about doing 4 and 5. And then they're like, our customers like that, but now they want to do something else. And it's like frustrating to have to shift gears and not see it all the way through. And I've definitely seen that happen from a design perspective as well, where for whatever reason, the customers, the market, our product owners have decided that going all the way through and seeing all the way through is tough. And but one nice thing about mobbing is that it helps build empathy for all those perspectives, right? And so, maybe a particular design is fairly simple, but it takes 8 cloud components that all talk to each other to make it happen and actually talk to your irrigation system or something like that. And so I think while those challenges still exist, mobbing can at least help build that empathy. And then we're going to share a couple stories here, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A. So what's this sticky story about, Gary?
Sure. So I guess this is kind of an example of, when the mob pulls me in and I can recognize the issue early on. That's always nice because it makes the whole process go smoother. So there was an issue recently where the mob that Austin was working in reached out, and I joined them, and they were having issues with some sticky elements. They had 2 columns, and when you scroll, they wanted the top part to stick, and it was working on one of the columns, but not the other column. So we did a little detective work. We looked to see, what has been changed recently? Why did it used to work and it didn't? We're checking the markup. Did something that was nested move? Was there new markup? And ultimately, it came down to while people were troubleshooting, I was able to do that researcher role real quick. So I had a browser window up, just looking at kind of reasons why sticky doesn't work. There's some nuances there, and it came down to a sibling element had an overflow property that was set, and apparently that doesn't jive well with sticky elements. So we were able to find the line of CSS, remove it. Test things out, commit and push like earlier, and we were done with the issue and everyone was happy. And, they were saying it would have taken them weeks to do it. So it felt really gratifying for me to be able to jump in as kind of like a specialist, perform the update that needed to be performed, and then, be done with that issue. So it was really effective, that mobbing session.
Yeah, and it was cool to see like our research on the Git history plus Gary's ideas. And then once we fixed that issue, it also raised another issue that I learned some really cool CSS tricks from. And so it's definitely learning came from it as well. How about this one though, Gary?
Sure. So there's times when the mob may call me in and they might think I'm knowledgeable in a subject, and I'm just not there yet. So this was something that had to do with Angular libraries. We're all kind of new to it, the mob and myself. And they reached out because they were having some broken image paths. So we did some experimentation right in the browser. It didn't seem, I didn't understand why the path was broken. So we tried changing paths, and it came down to, because it was a library and we both kind of had an idea of the direction we wanted to go. They had started to implement a fix, but eventually we started to turn our wheels and we weren't making much progress. So, we don't want to waste time, so to speak, too much time. So we decided to circle back to it. And I let the mob know, I'll continue looking into this. If I find anything, I'll let you know, and vice versa. And I think it was by the next day, the mob basically came to a solution that was pretty much on par with the solution I was going to suggest, where they're going to pull in the images from the container app that the library is going to get loaded into. So we can still develop in isolation in the library, as long as the directories are the same on the machines. So it's pulling in the assets from the container app into the library as you build. And then when you go to build the production version, it adjusts the paths. And when it's brought into the main app, it's able to resolve the paths. So it's just an example where it didn't go as smooth as the first example, where I could recognize the issue early on. This was kind of uncharted territory. So, it wasn't as smooth. There were some awkward silences. We were trying to figure out things, but ultimately, it was resolved and we were able to move past it.
Yeah, and I think it's a great example of psychological safety. We can be vulnerable and saying we don't know. And I think that's a great thing to model to the team, so others can share when they don't know, and that can lead to learning. And so mobbing doesn't always have to be all just fantastic problem solving, for example. So thank you so much for your time. You're welcome to connect with us. We love to connect with you. Me and Gary are both on LinkedIn. We'll put those links in the chat here in a moment. And also another coworker of me and Gary is Chris Lucian, and me and Chris run a video cast and podcast together, where we interview people all over the world who are practicing mob programming. And also they share about other things they're passionate about in the Agile and the product development world. But now would be a great time for a Q&A. Is there any other questions? And I'll be looking through the past ones. If there's any others.
While we're waiting for some questions, I just posted in the chat, we'll be hosting Austin again next month at a different meetup. You'll have to join that one too if you want. It's called Future of Product. I put the link in the chat if you're interested in that. It's all things future.
I see a question. Joe, what you got?
So yeah, I'm sorry I missed the first half, and you might have already covered this. Do you guys approach it with like what you do, is it up to the mob, or do you usually have like a best practices for implementing TDD? Do you let that kind of drive how you implement that feature? Is it just up to the mob? Is there like a recommended way of implementing tests and writing unit tests with a mob context?
Yeah, absolutely. Mobbing doesn't necessarily have to go with TDD, but I've seen in practice, often it does. There's a great synergy there. It gives a great anchoring point for a group. So we can be like, okay, what do we think the code we should do? And then we write a test that proves that. So, okay, there should be a button here that when you click it, it's going to go to this backend route or whatever, right? And then we can run experiments and be like, oh, okay, hey, what do you want to try? And oh, that failed, the test still fails, right? Or oh, that worked great and the test passes. And then we can think as a group how to refactor. And so the red-green refactor loop of TDD works really well in a group in a mobbing type setting. And from what I've seen, the skill to do TDD well spreads much more like wildfire with mobbing than any other context. It's much harder to spread that skill around in non-mobbing contexts, in my experience.
I went to another mob programming meetup. It was in Greece, and they asked a very similar question, which I think is her question, which is like, how common is this in industry, and like, do I have to fight for it? And do I have to like convince my whole team this is a good idea? And like business people are like, this is crazy. Everyone working on one problem. I think that was like the heart of it, because it seemed that was like a big topic in the other mob programming meetup. They talked about that for a while.
Yeah, so it's definitely more of a new and novel thing. Yeah, so I mean, it may require, if you wanted to run the experiment, depending on your context, to do some sort of justification for some time to run the experiment. Some contexts care less about how you work, just that the work gets done. So there's been a lot of data gathered on async code review and review processes, and how much wait time is involved in that. And the link I just shared in the chat starts talking about that. So one way to maybe frame the conversation would be like, throughput, cycle time, wait time, because when you compare it just to it abstractly thinking like, oh, mob programming sounds crazy. But when you compare it to something like a review process, like a code review or a design review process where there's a lot of waiting and engagement can be low and all these sorts of problems, if you bring everyone together, keep moving people closer together until the wait time goes away, hey, you're pairing and mobbing, and the wait time and the goes down and the throughput goes up, in my experience. So yeah.
I've got one last quick question, and this was actually a takeaway from the other meetup. It was in Greece, by the way. If you guys, virtual meetups are awesome because you can like travel and like check out what other people are doing. So the big thing that they pushed, or the main speaker talked about, was like an in-between between freestyle and all the prescribed roles I think that I saw from the game, which was the driver never gives his input or her input, and the mob is really telling the driver what to do, and then you keep switching the driver. And the only downside to that he saw, and maybe you guys can speak about this, was that the driver is sometimes like an expert in that particular framework or API, and he or she might need to step out and be like, not be the driver and be able to like, participate in the mob, if you will. But that in between he found was a sweet spot for a lot of organizations, where they say everyone can participate and everyone takes the keyboard, but the driver cannot give input, because then the driver kind of takes over the process. I don't know what you guys have thoughts on, if you guys have thoughts on that whole thing. So. Yeah.
I think that seems to be pretty common. I think that can be called the mini navigators, where there's one driver, but many navigators. I think if I'm right, Gary, that seems to be what, at least your recent experiences with me and other mobs, what patterns have you seen when you come in as a designer?
Yeah, those whole roles are kind of ideas. You don't have to be so strict, I think, and it works differently from organization to organization. But there's definitely times where I'm called to come in, and it's just so much easier if I'm navigating and driving at the same time. It's kind of an anti-pattern, but it works well because it can be cumbersome to try to tell somebody where to go to click, right, when you could just do it in 2 seconds. But part of it is a mutual understanding, and if I can explain what I'm doing at the same time, I think it's really beneficial to the team as well. And like Austin said, there's little tips and tricks you can glean just from watching somebody else navigate, whether it's inspecting elements in the browser, or changing properties on the fly in the inspector. But yeah, I don't know about the strictness of the roles. I think like you said, the sweet spot could be somewhere in between freestyle and the super strict roles.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to experiment, adapt, and repeat. So you keep trying. I've seen some people love the strict mode because it gives them very designated times to do their thing, and think deeper thoughts while someone else is driving and navigating. I've seen people really love the freestyle and the wildness of that. And then I've seen I think the most common is something in between, like you're talking about, Joe. That's what I've seen the most of.
Cool. Well, we're at time, and I want to be cognizant of everyone's obligations as well as my own. Thanks everyone for coming out. Hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you, Austin and Gary, for speaking and presenting. This was phenomenal. And we'll see you in a couple months.
Sounds
or
great.
next time at the Future of Product. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.